So let's go ahead and take a look at starting a new graph now for our next material, which is going to be denim. So I can come up to this package here where we've gone ahead and created our other knit graph, and I'll just right click, go down to new and substance graph, and that's going to bring up this template. And the reason I did this versus going up to file and new or hitting this new button here is it's going to create a whole new package to then go ahead and save this graph in. But I want to keep this all within the package that we already have going. So that's why I went ahead and right clicked it instead. So I'm going to continue to use the PBR metallic roughness, and I'm just going to call this denim. And again, we can keep all of these to the default value. So with the denim, I want to go ahead and start pretty much like we did with the knit material, where I went and created just a basic shape, and then we used that to kind of iterate and build up our final pattern. So we can go over here and create another shape. And I'll quickly just plug this into our normal, AO, and height. And we can just get rid of these. And I'm going to also go ahead and just add an ambient occlusion node before our AO output. So that's pretty much set us up to get started now. So with this shape node, what I want to do is actually go ahead and start creating this kind of rectangular oval shape so that it's got some straight lines across kind of the body. But then I want to go ahead and round off the edges so that it's got kind of this pill-like shape to it. So first, to create the body, let's go ahead with this shape node here. And I'm just going to shrink it down on the Y to around 0.5. So we can see with this shape node, right, we're just going to get this rectangle in the center. And now, unfortunately, there isn't any kind of pill-shaped patterns that we can draw from. So what we're actually going to have to do is create another shape node. And this time, we're going to use a circle or a disc. And then with this shape, we can go ahead and blend this over top to kind of combine these two grayscale images. So let's go and add a blend node between these. And I'll plug this one in over top. And the blending mode that I'm going to want to use is going to be multiply. And what multiply does is basically keep any white values between those images and get rid of the darker values. So you can see that we've basically kept all of the white values in the body of this thread, but kind of towards the edges there, if we take a look, they've just kind of erased those. So this is a good start, but we're not quite there yet. With this circular disc shape, I want to decrease it on the Y. And in my testing, I think 0.68 was a good value. And I'm also going to bring the scale down to around 0.95. Yeah, that looks good. So that's going to be perfect to get us going with our base shape. But now again, like with our knit material, I want to kind of round out these very contrasted edges because this is not going to look good in our normal map and all of our other outputs. So let's go ahead and add a new node this time, which is going to be a bevel node. And I'll just shift click to steal that and plug it into the grayscale socket. And what the bevel node is going to do is kind of like the blur. It's going to be used to simulate bevel or chamfered edges if you're familiar with 3D at all. So with this distance slider, when it's in the positive, we can see that it's actually going to kind of extrude a gradient outwards from our initial shape. However, if I go and bring this slider into the negative, it's actually going to cast inwards instead and create, again, this kind of beveled edge. So because we don't have a lot of space in the positive direction, as we can see when I go a little bit positive here, it's going to be thrown off of our texture sheet. I'm going to go into the negative about 0.3. And then we'll also have this smoothing option, which again is going to work more like the blur node that we've seen, where it's just going to try and smooth all of that. And I'll bring that all the way up to 5. So we can see without it, we're going to get some kind of sharper edges, but when we bring that up, it's going to be a little bit more rounded. And now finally, what we can do is just go ahead and use another blur high quality grayscale, just to make sure that it is indeed very smooth and we're not getting any of those really harsh faceted edges. And I'll go and use again a quality of 1, And I'll crank this intensity up to around 16. So it's going to be very, very soft. Now, there's one more thing I want to do for this pattern before we get to tiling it, and it's going to be somewhat similar to what we did with the knit, where we tried to remove some of the values kind of towards the edges here, because we can see that with our blur modifier or our blur node there, it's actually kind of bleeding over into the next UV space. So what I want to do is with another blend node, we're going to blend in a gradient over top to kind of eliminate those values. So the node that we can use to do this is very convenient. If we start to type in gradient, you can see we have a whole range of different gradient nodes we can work with. And the one that I want is going to affect both the left and the right side, which is going to be this gradient linear 2, because you can see that it goes from one side towards a center kind of bright white value, and then it comes back down onto the other side. And very conveniently, in the node's parameters, it actually has a rotation, so I don't need to use a transformation 2D node to get this done. So I can just flip this to be 90 degrees, and now it's going to be from left to right, which is going to be perfectly lined up with the direction and orientation of this shape here. So let's plug this into our blend. And the blending mode I'm going to want to use is going to be multiply again, right? Because if we take a look, the brightest values are going to be completely fine across both of these values here, but the darker values are going to be erased from any values that are brighter. So we can see that it's just pretty much taken this and shrunken it in a little bit. And just like that, this has pretty much completed the basic shape that we're going to need. So now let's get into tiling this. Now I want to show you a different tiling node that we can use, which is going to be the tile generator node. So this is going to give us pretty much the exact same functionality as the tile sampler did in the knit material. However, it's a little bit more bare bones, which ultimately means that it's going to be a little bit faster to process. And for the functionality that I'm going to need for this, this is going to be a good node to work with. So I'm going to hook up this tile generator and again, make sure that we plug our pattern into the pattern input and not the background. And again, we're going to need to go and actually specify in this node that we want to use our input pattern. So with this node selected, let's scroll all the way down to pattern and select image input. And again, I'm going to just switch our input filtering to be bilinear just to make sure we're getting the highest resolution of our input image. So now we've got our base pattern tiling, but it's not exactly looking like denim quite yet. So the place I want to start is by going up to our X and Y amount, and we're going to want to have more on the Y amount than we do on the X to kind of crush things in vertically and make them a little bit slimmer. So let's go and change the Y amount to around 80, and I'm going to change the X amount to around 36. And I found in my testing that these values work pretty good for this material. Now the next thing I want to do is get rid of every other column here. And that's going to make sense in a little bit as to why I want to do that. So the way that we can do that is if we scroll all the way down to where we have this color header, we'll notice that we have a couple options for masks. And this is an area where the tile generator is likely going to differ from the tile sampler. So we can see that I have this checker mask. We can use a horizontal mask as well. And finally, the mask that I want to use is going to be this vertical mask, as it's going to mask off, like I said, every other column. So now the reason I wanted to do that, if we come back up to our position header here, is that I want to give each one of these an offset so that we'll start getting that cascading pattern that you can see in Denim. So as I start to drag this up, you can see it's offsetting each one of these patterns, and I'm going to give it an offset of 0.5. And hopefully you can start to see kind of the Denim pattern coming together. Again, if I hit spacebar in my 2D view and we take a look, a value of 0.5 is going to give us a nice tiling material as well. So that's going to be sweet. Now I want to go and also change the scaling of these as well, so that we can kind of fill the gaps vertically here. So I'm going to scroll back up to our size header, and I'm going to use this scale slider and just switch that up to 2. And that's going to really fill out our pattern, both vertically and horizontally there. But we still have a bit of a gap on the X or horizontal axis in between these threads that I kind of want to fill out just a little bit. And so it's not going to be entirely obvious as how we can do that with the tile generator. And this is another area where this might differ from the tile sampler. But realistically, we can do it two different ways. We can use this middle size option, again horizontal, because that's the axis that we want to alter this on. And if I start to bring this up or bring this down, we can see that it's going to scale it out on the X. However, you'll notice that as I'm bringing this up, right, it's kind of only scaling or favoring one side that it's scaling in. But if I bring this back down and start to use the interstice X option here, you'll notice that it's going to scale in and out kind of from the center of the shapes. And so this is the slider I'm going to want to use. Now, my slider looks a little bit different than yours probably does just because I was doing some testing off camera, but by default, the slider should actually be on the left side with a value of 0. And so as you probably saw, when I brought it into a negative value, that's when it scaled it outwards. And that's exactly what we want to do. So remember that a lot of slider values within Substance Designer are actually just soft caps, meaning you can go ahead and input a custom value, and chances are the slider will accept that. So I'll just double click on our value here, and I want to enter a value of negative 0.05, and I'll hit enter, and that's just going to scale it out just a little bit more. So that's starting to look pretty good for our denim here. But I want to come down again to our color options. And just like we did for our knit pattern, I want to use a bit of randomness for the grayscale values of our pattern. And now in this particular node, it's actually called luminance random, but it works exactly the same as the color random slider did in the tile sampler. So I'll double click on this, and I'm going to use a value of 0.3. And hopefully you're able to see that on your screen, but it's given our patterns here across the entire tiling a bit of a random grayscale value so that it's not going to be all at the same height. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and just switch our blending mode to be max so that way, if for whatever reason we want to go ahead and scale our thing up to maybe like 3, you can see it's just kind of like intersecting with each other, instead of what it was by default with add, where it's just going to kind of blow all of our values out to a pure white. But I'll go ahead and Control Z that, and we'll just take it back to how we had it. So now where do we go from here, right? Well, I want to address these gaps in these thread patterns here, because if we take a look at a denim material, we'll notice that in between each one of these longer threads, there's going to be somewhat of a smaller little piece in there. And so a very convenient way that we can go about addressing that is actually using the generator we've already set up. And so in this instance, I'll just bring this up. And with the node selected, I'm going to hit Control D, and this is going to duplicate that node. And again, all of its parameters that come with it. So now what we can do is just alter some of these values that we have to really quickly get up and going with tweaking this pattern. So the first tweak I want to do is go back up to our size here, and I want to increase our interstice now so that we're going to scale it in on the X. So I'm going to double click on this, and a value of around 0.75 seemed to work for me. So you can see we're going to get really, really tiny threads there. And now let's just go ahead and add a blend node, and let's blend these two together. So I'm going to use this top one actually as our background there. So let's just do a bit of a reversal here. And I'll drag our little tiny patterns into the top. And let's go and use a blending mode of screen this time. And the reason we want to use screen is because I want to try and keep all of the brighter values from this top image here and get rid of these black values. And screen is going to do exactly that. So I'll just hold down Shift and steal this connection again so we can see what's going on in our 3D. And we'll notice that while we've kind of crushed it down on the X, it's actually still in the same place, right? So it's kind of overlaid over top. So what we'll have to do with our tile generator node is come back into the position And I'm going to have to go to the global offset. And I just have to move this on the X here. And we can see it's actually a very, very small movement of around 0.3, at least for me. And actually, I might do it 0.025. Oh, and that actually looks like it was a little bit too far. So let's do 0.028 so that we're going to get the nice big threads kind of cascading downwards. And in between those, we're going to get those smaller threads. And so now it's really starting to look like our denim pattern. Now, the final thing I want to do before we close out this pattern video is pretty much the same thing we did for our knit, where we went ahead and created some random stray fibers here and there. So one way we could go about doing this is actually go back into our knit graph by double clicking, selecting the nodes that we use to create that scratchy fibers with, hitting Control C to copy that to our clipboard, and then coming back into this graph and hitting Control V to paste it, which would be a pretty effective method of doing that. However, I'm going to show it again from scratch just because I want to try and get you familiarized with some of the nodes and what they do. So again, let's go and add our directional scratches node. And this is going to give us that scratchy pattern. So a couple things I want to do with this node. First, let's go ahead and switch the scale up to 8, which is going to give us some smaller details. I'm going to bring the size Y down significantly to around maybe something like 8. And we can also just go ahead and give some different random sizes for both the X and the Y. Now again, it doesn't really matter, but I like to add just a little bit of randomness to it. And that should be okay for our directional scratches node. Let's also go ahead and add a directional warp node. And we can plug this into our input. And I'll want to use some kind of random noise to create the intensity input here. So again, I'll drag and drop this out. And using a Gaussian noise, which is a pretty good noise to use for this kind of work, so that we can see it's going to kind of warp just a little bit. Now I might bring the size or the scale up on this guy here to maybe something around 42 instead, just to create something a little bit smaller. And I think this is going to be good to go for our kind of scratchy stray fibers. So if we bring this back, I'm going to add another blend node onto our chain, and we can drag and drop this directional warp into the top node there. And again, the blending mode I want to use for this is going to be screen as well, because I want to try and keep some of those brighter values, but get rid of the black values. And we're going to really decrease the opacity here to something like 0.05. So it's going to be very, very subtle. And actually, that might be a little too subtle. Let's try 0.1. And I think that's going to be okay. We can kind of see just a little bit of those fibers going across the denim there. And so finally, the last thing I want to change before we close this video out is by taking a look at our ambient occlusion, we can see that, again, the shadow values are maybe a little bit too intense, which is not going to look too great in our 3D view here. So I'll come down to our height depth option, and let's go and change this to something around 0.02 again, so that we can see a little bit more of that scratchy fiber detail, and it's not going to look like it's just completely enshrouded in darkness. And for an initial pattern, that's starting to look pretty good. So in the previous video, we took a look at defining the height map for our denim material, but let's look at finalizing the output textures, which we'll use in our final renders. So the first two things I want to take a look at are defining the block out colors for our main pieces. And primarily there's going to be two, which is going to be the denim kind of blue thread pattern, and then this white color that's going to run through kind of our adjacent smaller secondary patterns here. So let's go and take a look up at our base color output, and I'll bring this up and over. And let's just bring this uniform color out. And I'm going to drag and drop a new uniform color into our graph so that we're going to have two of these. So for this top color, I'm going to use an eyedropper tool because I have our colors off screen. And this is just going to be a pure white value. And for our bottom color, I'll do the same thing, again, dragging and dropping. And we're going to have kind of this navy blue color. And what we'll want to do is use a blend node to blend these together. So again, plugging in our white color for the foreground, our blue color for the background, and plugging this in. And that's just going to give us a white color. So like we had seen briefly before, the way that we're going to be able to section off white colors for these patterns and blue colors for these patterns is by inputting a mask into the opacity socket for our blend node. And so this is an area where sometimes you might have to get crafty with how you're actually defining these masks. Now, fortunately for us, we've created a pretty flexible height map that actually has given us a pretty good mask. And that's going to be this tile generator right here, right? Because we've got pure white values for the areas that we actually want to denote as being white. So I'm going to just click this socket here, and we can drag this up and plug this into the opacity socket. And we can see now it's going to color the white values of those areas. But we'll notice that kind of towards the edges there, it's still looking a little bit blue. And that's because our mask, if we take a look, is kind of soft around the edges. And so we need to sharpen that up a little bit. And now this is an area where you do kind of want to have very contrasted grayscale images, is when you're defining masks for specific things. But all is not lost, because we do have a good node we can use to really sharpen this up. So on this selection here, I'm going to go ahead and type in histogram once again, and I'm going to want to use a histogram scan node. And so what this node will do is, if we go ahead and take a look, is essentially scan through the histogram, kind of like what we did with the histogram select. However, we don't have as much flexibility as we did with that node. And so instead, it's just going to scan from white to black and give us an output of those pixel values. So I can go and just bring this all the way up, and we'll see that it's maybe reaching a little bit farther than we need it to. So let's just bring this down until we kind of get a good area. And I can also go and bring this contrast slider up, which is going to sharpen it out. Now, it maybe is a little bit too sharp, so we can maybe dial that back to about halfway-ish. And so I think around 0.9 is going to be a good area for that. So that's going to be our blockout colors, but we're going to want to add a couple more colors than just a pure white and a pure black. So let's go ahead and drag out our output here to give us some more space. And I'm going to add another blend node. So for this first option here, what I want to use this for is to give a little bit of kind of like highlights and wear to the tops of these values, so that they're going to be a little bit of a brighter blue, so that you get the kind of the effect, like because these surface values are a little bit more exposed, they might be a little bit more worn. So we can still use this white value that we have up here and plug that in. However, the value that I want to use for our blending mode is going to be overlay. And overlay is going to kind of keep us in the same hue range, but it's going to just allow us to use this white value to increase the luminosity, or the value, to make it a little bit brighter. Now, that doesn't look too great by default, but again, we can further refine this by using a mask. And again, the mask that I want to use is going to be drawn from our tile generator. However, this time I don't need it to be from this tile generator, but I'm going to instead use it from this one. So we can go and plug this into our opacity. And now we can see that this is only going across the blue areas. Now, I don't want it to be across the blue area entirely, right? Because that's really not changed anything or added any kind of variation. And so I want to be able to, from our tile generator, just select kind of the tip-top areas of this thread and then use that as our mask. And so we've already seen how we can do that pretty competently by using another histogram node. Again, the histogram select node. And I can go and bring this right up here with our other nodes. And so for this, what I want to do is change the position all the way up to 1, so that that's kind of the brightest values in our histogram. And we can increase the range to kind of work downwards a little bit. And you'll see in our 3D here, right? Hopefully you can kind of see without the highlights of our light there. As I bring this up, we're going to kind of work towards some of the darker areas. And so I think I'll do around 0.6 and a contrast of around 0.25. So that we're only kind of brightening up some of those more exposed areas. And already that's starting to add a little bit of variety to this. Actually, I think I might dial back our histogram scan again, and let's do maybe 0.8. I think that's just a little bit better. And I'll also bring our contrast down to maybe 0.15. So now the next thing I want to do is start to add a little bit of thread variation so that it's going to look as if this is actually thread and fabric, and we have some really tiny threads kind of running through these larger shapes that we've defined. Because it's such microscopic detail, most times you really wouldn't want to add that into your normal map or your height map, but instead you would want to just add that in the color. Because when we're working with textures and images, right, we are bound to the resolution that we're working in. And for something so small, it's oftentimes just way too difficult to add that kind of microscopic detail. So this is where we're going to add it. So let's go ahead and add another blend node. And again, we're going to be using this white value. And there's kind of two reasons why I want to do this. One, because I'm going to be using this in a subtraction blending mode, which white works very well for, but as well because we already have this white color in our graph, using and reusing the same nodes is going to make your materials a lot faster to process because we're not having to deal with loading 100 different nodes every time we make an update. And for this particular instance, because we still need a white value, why not go ahead and use something we already have? So now I'm going to show you another hotkey that we can use to kind of better organize our graph as well. And that's holding down Alt and dragging my mouse over our noodles here, or these connection lines. So you can see that it's going to give us this socket. And when I go ahead and click, I've now got a dot connection. So I can move this around and really organize our graph so that we're not just getting kind of this spaghetti connections all over the place. So I'll go ahead and connect this into here. And again, holding down Alt and clicking, I'll just drag this over. And so just like we did previously with this mask here, we're going to want to create a mask to define the area that we want this to take effect. And so this time, I'm not going to be using any information that we're driving from our height map, but instead I'm just going to use a procedural grunge. So let's go and take a look for directional noise. And in this case, I'm going to use the first one that we have here. And if we take a look, it's just kind of like our directional scratches, but a little bit different. You can see that we're getting some kind of irregular grunge noise, and we're getting just a ton of different grayscale values from black to white. And this is going to be really good to create some organicness. So let's go and just plug this in. And we can see some areas we're going to get a little bit more white, a little bit less white, and overall it's just going to be kind of chaotic. Now I actually want to run this kind of along the cascade of our threads here. And I also want to decrease the scale. So let's bring the scale up to around 4, so it's a lot smaller. And so we can kind of see those threads again. And I'm also going to change the angle to be around 45 degrees so that it's kind of running somewhat perpendicular to our threads here. And again, you could be a little bit more precise with it, but I think around 45 is good enough. We can also play around with the angle random. So maybe I'll do 0.05. And now instead of just copying this with whatever mask values we have in it, I actually want to switch the blending mode, like I mentioned, to be subtract. So now that's going to subtract from the color values. Now at the opacity of 1, it's a little bit intense. So let's bring that down to something like 0.15. And hopefully you can kind of see now, if we take a look, just a little bit of these random threads kind of running over the surface of this pattern. And now finally for our color, let's also go ahead and add some horizontal striations into the fabric as well to give it that much more detail. So with this blend node, we'll add yet another blend. And this time I'm going to go and use the original navy blue color that we had. So I'll plug this into here. And again, using Alt to just try and clean everything up a little bit. I'll bring these out and over. And now I'm going to want to go and define another mask. And again, we've already actually defined a mask for this, which was these kind of scuffy directional marks here, if we take a look. So I'll go and use this as our mask. If we bring this over and drop this into our opacity, and we can see that this is going to just be overlaid over top of some of our threads. Now the blending mode I want to use for this is going to be one we haven't used yet, which is going to be add linear dodge. And we'll bring our opacity down to 0.15 again. So that's going to just help highlight some of these areas that we had created for our height as well, and give us some directionality on the horizontal plane here. So the final thing I want to do to clean up our base color output is by using a node that's going to allow us to kind of highlight some of these microscopic details. And that's going to be the sharpen node. And again, if you've used any kind of 2D editor, you probably are somewhat familiar with sharpen, but really that's just going to help us, well, sharpen up the details that we have in this image. Again, a value of 0 is going to be what we have going into this node. And as we bring this up, it's going to find some edges and really kind of contrast this image a little bit. And I think a value of around 0.5 is actually good enough. You want to make sure that you don't go too far because it actually starts to introduce some new color values, which you don't really have control over. And oftentimes they don't really look good because they start adding edges where you maybe don't want to have some defined edges. But all in all, I think a value of 0.5 is going to look really good for our material. The next area I want to focus on is going to be our normals and our roughness. As we recall from the knit material, oftentimes they're pretty closely related, at least how I like to work with them. So if we take a look at our normals, we can see I really haven't touched it so far in this particular material. And truth be told, you don't ever really need to turn them up too high because again, this fabric is going to be incredibly tiny on our final assets, and you don't want the normals to be way too intense because a light intensity can work very well for something that's really, really crushed in. Now we could maybe go ahead and bring it up to something like 3 just because denim is a little bit coarser and a little bit more pronounced with its features, but I would not likely go anything higher than 3 because we do have to consider that this will be tiling many times over a particular surface. However, the reason I do also want to give it a little bit more intensity is for our roughness here. So let's go ahead and get rid of this uniform color and we can plug this in. But again, remember for our roughness, we're going to need a grayscale image. So again, let's go and use a curvature smooth, which is going to grayscaleify everything. And then we can use a levels node to kind of correct it and make it like how we want it to be. So I want to make sure that I bring up my black outputs here so that we really aren't getting any kind of glossiness really at all for this particular material. Again, because denim, is not super glossy in its features. I might also bring out bring down our white output a little bit. And then bring our middle gray just kind of towards the black to brighten everything up just a little bit there. And so I think something kind of like that is going to be good for our denim. And now just for completion's sake, we want to make sure again that our metallic output is a complete black value because we do not have any metallic bits in this particular material. We also want to make sure that our AO is nothing super crazy. And again, we might be able to even just bring this down to something like 0.01, which is going to be super light, and it's going to be up to your discretion. And finally, again, making sure that our height map is just going into the height map output, and that we are getting a good range from black to white with a little bit of discrepancy between some of our threads here, which we defined in our tile generator. And so with that, I think our outputs are looking pretty good for this material. So in this final video for our denim material, I want to take a look at exposing some parameters, which we're going to be able to use in other applications to increase the flexibility of this material. Now the parameters that I want to expose are just going to be superficial colors again this time, but this will give us a little bit more practice with exposing parameters to see how we can do it and to understand what's actually happening when we're doing this. So if we come all the way up to our color here, what I want to expose is our secondary color and primary color for the initial blockouts, which is going to drastically change the entire look of this denim. If we go ahead and take a look in our 3D view here, and I go and just change the hue of our primary navy blue here, we can see that this is going to very drastically change what our denim is going to look like. And we want to have this kind of functionality in our other applications just to make it a very convenient change so we can do it on the fly. So with this node selected, let's go ahead and, like we've seen, come over and select expose. And now because we have two particular outputs that are actually going to use the same identifier, right? This is an output color and this is going to be an output color. Let's go and use a new unique identifier. And I'm going to call this color primary, and I'll click OK. And I can go ahead and hit OK again. Now, if you accidentally create a typo, or maybe you realize you don't want to name it that, you don't have to worry. You can always change the identifier later, so you're not set in stone. I'll come up to our uniform color up here again and do the same exact thing, going ahead and exposing it. And let's go and change it to be a new one. And we can call this one color secondary. So like we've seen, now I'm not going to have access to those colors in either of these nodes because we've propagated it up, or basically just given access to these specific values from our graph. So if I double click in our graph area over here, we'll come to the attributes of this graph, and you can see that we have color primary and color secondary. So let's go and just open these up. And again, we're going to have them both set up for us already with the proper type and editor for our GUI. So I'm not going to need to change any of that. But what I do want to change is the actual human readable label, because right now it's just going to be color_primary. And I mean, it is pretty self-explanatory with the identifier we gave it. But I mean, this is fashion. Come on, we like things to be a little bit prim and proper, right? So we can go ahead and just give this a more proper name, such as primary color. And I'll go and give our label for our secondary as secondary color. So that now if I go ahead and preview these, we will see that we have access to our primary color, which if I go ahead and change, we'll change it in our viewport, and our secondary color, which again, will also give us a bit of a change. Now, when I go ahead and play around with this secondary color, you might notice that things are not exactly working as intended. And so I've kind of led us down this path intentionally to kind of give us a bit of an issue that we can try and overcome. And so if we take a look, right, as we go through our nodes, we've got our primary and secondary color. And we'll notice that as I continue along, right, remember that we were sharing this top value with the rest of these nodes because it was a white value. But now we've gone ahead and exposed this, and it's causing issues with the rest of our network here because it's no longer the white value we needed. And so a lot of times this is going to happen in your materials where you've maybe shared a specific node, not really realizing or thinking about the consequences of how it's going to be used if you go ahead and expose it later. Now, fortunately, this is a pretty easy fix, but I'm just highlighting it here to give you an example of kind of being aware of how you're going to be using these nodes. So what we can do to fix this very quickly is just drag in another uniform color and making this pure white. And so now what I can do, because I've gone ahead and set up our graph a little bit more organized, right, by adding these dot connections, is I can just drag this in and plug this into here. And now everything should work as intended. So now I can just add some space here, double click back in my graph, and actually I'll double click on our base color here first so we can see what we're doing, and come back down to our preview so that now when I go ahead and change this secondary pattern, it's no longer going to be affecting those other operations that we wanted to do.